apparent Israeli strike near Beirut that killed a Hamas leader. On Thursday, Israel Defense Forces reported several launches coming from Lebanese territory. And in response, the IDF struck at the source of the launches and also struck a launch post and an observation post. This Israeli woman's home is just 1 mile away from Israel's border with Lebanon. She's currently living in a hotel in a safer area, but she decided to visit her home and give this message.
It's scary, I must say. And we need to be sure that we're safe in order to come and live here again in our homes. So this is our request from our government, from our army. Please make us safe.
And on Wednesday, Israel's chief of the general staff met with troops on the northern border to discuss the situation.
Based on my impressions, we are in a very high state of readiness in the north. I think our readiness is at its peak.
And he also mentioned the apparent lapse in Israeli security that allowed the October 7th attacks to happen.
We are going to have more soldiers on the borders for at least the next year, and we will reach something much stronger. Because this event, as hard as it is, and we will talk about it a lot more, we could have known, we couldn't have known. It cannot repeat itself, that's for sure. And we need to provide a very, very strong response to this matter.
And on Thursday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. Netanyahu told him that Israel is committed to achieving its goals in the war. And for that, they'll apply maximum power and precision everywhere that's needed. And Graham responded by saying, "We have your back." Jason Berry, NTD News.
Established the Malaysian Sound of Revolution Radio in Yuyang City, Hunan Province, to broadcast in Malaysian, Thai, English, and other languages. After the Cultural Revolution, during a meeting between Singapore's President Lee Kuan Yew and Deng Xiaoping, Lee requested that Deng stop the radio broadcasts of the MCP and the Communist Party of Indonesia into China. At the time, the CCP was surrounded by enemies and isolated, and Deng had just regained power and required international support, so he accepted the recommendation. Deng met with MCP leader Chin Peng and set a deadline to shut down the broadcasts agitating for communist revolution. In addition to the countries noted above, the CCP also attempted to export the revolution to the Philippines, Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, Japan, and elsewhere, in some cases providing military training, and in some cases spreading propaganda. Some of these communist organizations later became internationally acknowledged terrorist groups. For example, the Japanese Red Army, which became notorious for its anti-monarchist and pro-violent revolutionary slogans, was responsible for a plane hijacking, the massacre of civilians at an airport, and a range of other terrorist incidents. Two, exporting revolution to Africa and Latin America. During the Cultural Revolution, the CCP often quoted a slogan by Karl Marx, quote, "The proletariat can liberate itself only by liberating all of humanity." The CCP preaches world revolution. In the 1960s, the former Soviet Union was going through a period of contraction and was forced to promote the cutback of external revolution. The goal became to peacefully coexist with Western capitalist countries and provide less support to the Third World revolutionary movements. The CCP called this policy revisionism. In the early 1960s, CCP ambassador to the Soviet Union, Wang Jiaxiang, made a similar proposal but was criticized by Mao as being too friendly to the imperialists, revisionists, and reactionaries, and not supportive enough to the world revolutionary movement. Therefore, in addition to exporting revolution to Asia, Mao also competed with the Soviet Union in Africa and Latin America. In August 1965, CCP Minister of National Defense Lin Biao claimed in his article, quote, "Long live the victory of the People's War," that a high tide in world revolution was imminent. According to Mao's theory of encircling the cities from rural areas, which is how the CCP seized power in China, the article compares North America and Western Europe to cities, and thinks of Asia, Africa, and Latin America as rural areas. Therefore, exporting revolution to Asia, Africa, and Latin America became an important political and ideological task for the CCP. A. Latin America. Professor Chung Ying Hong of the University of Delaware wrote the following in his article, quote, Exporting Revolution to the World, an exploratory analysis of the influence of the Cultural Revolution in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In Latin America, Maoist communists in the mid-1960s established organizations in Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Venezuela, and Ecuador. The main members were young people and students. With the support of China, in 1967, Maoists in Latin America established two guerrilla groups, the Popular Liberation Army of Colombia, which included a female company that mimicked the Red Detachment of Women and was called the Maria Cano Unit, and Bolivia's Nyanca Huazu Guerrilla, or National Liberation Army of Bolivia. Some communists in Venezuela also launched armed violence actions in the same period. In addition, the left leader of the Peruvian Communist Party, Abimael Guzman, was trained in Beijing in the late 1960s. Apart from studying explosives and firearms, more importantly was his grasping of Mao Zedong thought, particularly ideas of, quote, the spirit of transforming to matter, and that with the correct route, one can go from, quote, not having personnel to having personnel, not having guns to having guns.
On the front lines today after they report coverage that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to visit the region in hopes to find some sort of peaceful resolution. That was real since Southern Command.
What are you doing? We're looking systematic to try to diffuse that challenge.
Prime Minister who says there will be no to the until Hamas is dismantled hostages home to no threat to Israel. So the official.
Ties with the CCP in order to win over Cuba and at the same time compete with the Soviet Union for the leadership of the international communist movement. The CCP extended to Che Guevara a $60 million loan in November 1960 when he visited China. This was at a time when the Chinese people were dying of starvation from the Great Leap Forward campaign. Zhou Enlai also told Guevara that the loan could be waived through negotiations. When Fidel Castro began leaning toward the Soviet Union, after Sino-Soviet relations broke down, the CCP sent a large number of propaganda pamphlets to Cuban officials and civilians through the embassy in Havana in an attempt to instigate a coup against the Castro regime. B. Africa. Chung also described, in the article Exporting Revolution to the World, how the CCP influences the independence of African countries and what kind of path they take after independence. According to Western media reports, before the mid-1960s, some African revolutionary youth from Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, Cameroon, and Congo received training in Harbin, Nanjing, and other Chinese cities. A member of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, described his one-year training in Shanghai. In addition to military training, it was mainly political studies, how to mobilize rural people and launch guerrilla warfare with the goal of people's war. An Oman guerrilla described his training received in China in 1968. He was sent by the organization first to Pakistan, then took a Pakistan airline plane to Shanghai, then to Beijing. After visiting model schools and communes in China, he was sent to a training camp for military training and ideological education. The curriculum of Mao Zedong's works was the most important in the schedule. Trainees must memorize many quotations from Mao. The part about discipline and how to interact with the rural masses was very similar to the, quote, 3 major disciplines and 8 items of attention used by the People's Liberation Army. The African trainees also witnessed China during the Cultural Revolution. For example, during a visit to a school, when a teacher asked, how to treat gangster elements. Students replied repeatedly in unison, kill, kill, kill. At the end of the training, every Omani trainee received a book by Mao translated into Arabic. Assistance to Tanzania and Zambia was the largest of the CCP's external revolution projects in Africa in the 1960s. The CCP sent a large number of experts from the Shanghai Textile Industry Bureau to help build the Tanzanian Friendship Textile Factory. The person in charge injected a strong ideological tone into these aid projects. Upon arrival in Tanzania, he organized a rebel team, hung the 5-star red flag of the PRC on the construction site, erected a statue of Mao and Mao's quotations, played cultural revolution music, and sang Mao quotes. The construction site became a model of the Cultural Revolution overseas. He also organized a propaganda team to promote Mao Zedong thought and actively spread rebellious views among the Tanzanian workers. Tanzania was not happy about the CCP's attempts to export revolution. Afterward, Mao decided to build the Tanzania-Zambia railway that would also connect East Africa with Central and Southern Africa. The railway passed through mountains, valleys, turbulent rivers, and lush forests. Many areas along the route were deserted and inhabited only by wildlife. Some of the roadbeds, bridges, and tunnels were constructed on foundations of silt and sand, making the work extremely difficult. There were 320 bridges and 22 tunnels built. China sent 50,000 laborers, of whom 66 died, and spent nearly 10 billion yuan. It took 6 years to complete the work, from 1970 to 1976. However, due to poor and corrupt management in Tanzania and Zambia, the railway went bankrupt. The equivalent cost of the railway today would be hundreds of billions of Chinese yuan, or in the tens of billions of US dollars. 3. Exporting revolution to Eastern Europe. A. Albania. The CCP not only exported revolutions to Africa and Latin America, but also spent a great deal of effort to gain influence over Albania, another communist country. As early as when Nikita Khrushchev gave his secret speech marking the era of de-Stalinization, Albania was ideologically aligned with the CCP. Mao was greatly pleased, and he began the program of giving aid to Albania, regardless of the cost. Xinhua news agency reporter Wang Hongqi wrote, quote, from 1954 to 1978, China provided financial aid to the Party of Labor of Albania 75 times. The sum in the agreement was more than 10 billion Chinese yuan. At the time, the population of Albania was only around 2 million, which meant each person received the equivalent of 4,000 Chinese yuan. On the other hand, the average annual income of a Chinese person at the time was no more than 200 yuan. Within this period, China was also experiencing the Great Leap Forward and the resulting famine, as well as the economic collapse caused by Mao's Cultural Revolution. During the Great Famine, China used its extremely scarce hard currency foreign reserves to import food supplies. In 1962, Rez Mili, the Albanian ambassador to China, demanded aid in food supplies. Under the command of Party Vice Chairman Liu, the Chinese ship carrying wheat purchased from Canada and due for China changed course and unloaded the wheat at an Albanian port. Meanwhile, Albania took the CCP's aid for granted and wasted it. The enormous amount of steel, machine equipment, and precision instruments sent from China were left exposed to the elements. Albanian officials were dismissive. Quote, it's of little importance. If it breaks or disappears, China will simply give us more. China helped Albania construct a textile factory, but Albania did not have cotton, so China had to use its foreign reserves to buy cotton for Albania. On one occasion, the vice president of Albania, Adil Karkani, asked Di Biao, the Chinese ambassador in Albania at the time, to replace major equipment at a fertilizer factory and demanded that the equipment be from Italy. China then bought machines from Italy and installed them for Albania. Such so-called aid only instills greed and laziness in the recipient. In October 1974, Albania demanded a loan of 5 billion yuan from China. At the time, it was late in the Cultural Revolution, and China's economy had collapsed almost completely. In the end, China still decided to lend 1 billion yuan. However, Albania was greatly unsatisfied and started an anti-Chinese movement in its country with slogans like, quote, "We shall never bow our heads" in the face of economic pressure from a foreign country. It also declined to support China with petroleum and asphalt.
Party is calling on Turkey to cut ties with NATO. The group's party leader says all of the attacks in Iraq, Iran, Libya, as well as in Palestine are perpetuated by America. Back in the U.S., the Supreme Court justices are allowing the state of Idaho to enforce its abortion ban even in cases of medical emergencies, at least for now. The justices say they will hear arguments on both sides in April. The case in Idaho is the Supreme Court's second major abortion dispute since overturning Roe v. Wade, which allows states to severely restrict or ban abortions. The court is also hearing a challenge to the Food and Drug Administration's rules for mifepristone, a drug commonly used for medicated abortion, following a minor elective medical procedure. But it's the Defense Department's first acknowledgement that he had been admitted 5 days earlier to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Air Force Major General Pat Ryder said Friday that it was not clear when Austin would be released from the hospital, but said the secretary was, quote, recovering well. Now, the Pentagon's failure to disclose Austin's hospitalization is counter to normal practice with the president and other senior U.S. officials and cabinet members. The Pentagon Press Association, which represents media members who cover the Defense Department, sent a letter of protest to Ryder and Chris Meagher, the Assistant Defense Secretary for Public Affairs.
There are currently 4 countries ruled by self-declared communist regimes: China, Vietnam, Cuba, and Laos. Although India has abandoned Leninist communism, in actuality, it is communist totalitarian. There were 27 communist countries. Now, there are 13 countries where communist parties are allowed to participate in politics, while there are currently about 120 countries that have registered communist parties. But over the past century, communist influence in government has faded away in most countries. However, countries under socialism, rather than calling themselves communist, the political parties took on names like the Democratic Socialist Party, the People's Socialist Party, and the like. Of the 33 independent countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, the majority have communist parties that are accepted as legitimate political players. In Venezuela, Chile, Uruguay, and elsewhere, the Communist Party and the ruling party often form coalition governments, while communist parties in other countries play the role of opposition. In the West, and in some countries in other regions, communism did not resort to violent methods as was done in the East, but through subversion, it has subtly infiltrated society and achieved its goals of destroying people's moral values, destroying the culture God has imparted to them, and spreading communist and socialist ideologies. The Spectre has, in fact, gained control over the entire world. Achieving the ultimate goal of destroying humankind is only a step away.
And it's affecting us all personally, of course. My son is, as of next week, will be married 6 months and has spent half of his married life in the Army, which isn't really great for a relationship. But we're all dealing with it the best we can on an individual basis. Nationally, we're still in a sense of trauma and a sense of grief, anger from the massacre that took place on October 7th. And that grief is compounded every day when we wake up and hear the news of the latest 2, 3, 5, even 10 soldiers one day who have been killed. The economy's been impacted widely. Yet, despite all of that, there's an unbelievable sense of solidarity. The soldiers with whom I've met, on behalf of the Genesis 123 Foundation, we've been giving out army jackets like you see on the back of my chair here to keep soldiers warm in the winter. And the soldiers are motivated, and their families are very, very supportive. And we as a country are unusually united in the face of this war.
And we're certainly hearing a lot about that here in the U.S. So now moving to what's happening right here in the U.S., Jonathan Tobin, are you surprised by the increasing support for the pro-Palestinian movements right here, especially as we're seeing from ongoing protests around the country as well as from some elected officials?
Well, I think the calculations of Hamas were wrong in some respects. They thought Israel would not respond the way it has. They thought they could get away with it, and they were wrong about that. But they were right in one respect. They thought the spectacle of the greatest mass slaughter of Jews, the largest mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, would set off, instead of a backlash against them and their cause, that it would generate a wave of anti-Semitism around the world. And they were right. I think the genesis of this wave of anti-Semitism is not so much a genuine concern for the Palestinians as it's a function of ideology. So much of American culture and politics has been taken over by the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and critical race theory, intersectionality, which falsely analogizes the Palestinian war against Israel to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. So I think a generation of young Americans has been indoctrinated in the toxic and false idea that Israel is a white oppressor of Palestinian people of color. This is a big lie. The war and the conflict between Jews and Arabs is not racial. Jews and Arabs are the same race. The majority of Israeli Jews are themselves people of color by the definitions of the American left, because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa. So this is completely false, as is the idea that Israel is indiscriminately killing Palestinian civilians, when in fact it is doing everything that it can to avoid doing that, as Hamas hides behind them. So I think there's a false premise, there's an ideology driving it, and it's quite frankly not surprising that the natural result of DEI, which some of us have been saying for years, granted a permission slip to anti-Semitism, has resulted in just that, when in fact the civilized world should be behind the victim of the October 7th atrocities, not the perpetrators.
Like you mentioned, the war itself has sparked many debates domestically about ideologies and, of course, among different political parties. Bradley, you have done considerable amount of research on the Middle East, and in a recent opinion article you wrote that, quote, far-right Hamas found common cause in hating Jews. What do you mean?
Yes, exactly that. The rise in anti-Semitism, we've seen it on the far left with the rise of DEI ideology on university campuses. But we've also seen a rise of anti-Semitism as it relates to the fringes of the far right in white nationalist circles, white supremacist circles. My colleague, Dr. Liram Koblet-Stenser from Reichman University, based in Israel, we wrote that op-ed in the Jerusalem Post, highlighting how in alternative platforms such as Gab and 4chan, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, quoting Hitler in such kind ways and in a positive light. And on a surface level, that may seem surprising, but as we've seen in November, Israeli President Isaac Herzog showed to the BBC a copy of Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler that was found on the body of Hamas, the terrorist in northern Gaza. So this is a connection that's been going as far back as the inception of Palestinian identity itself, with Haj Amin al-Husseini going to Nazi Germany to try and persuade Adolf Hitler to extend his genocide to the Jews of the Middle East. So this rise in anti-Semitism, we've been seeing it across the spectrum from the left, but also on the right, and it shows that whether it's socialism, communism, or Nazism, they're two sides of the same coin.
And Jonathan Tobin, do you agree with that?
Well, I think that's certainly true to some extent. The anti-Semitism has always existed on the far right as on the far left. But the problem now is not a few, random extremists posting on, channels or parts of the internet. The problem is the mobs on the streets of American cities, blocking traffic, disrupting Christmas celebrations, mobs on college campuses, intimidating Jewish students, all chanting for the destruction of Israel and the genocide of its population. These are phenomenon of the left. This phenomenon, unlike the far right, which has virtually no influence, on Capitol Hill or in American politics, the anti-Israel left, the DEI intersectional left, has enormous influence within our political system. It is exerting tremendous pressure on President Biden and his administration to back away from Israel. That is why the administration spends so much time talking out of both sides of its mouth about the war, because it's afraid of its own left wing, which it needs. Biden needs, his left wing to have any hope of beating former President Trump next November.
So, Jonathan Feldstein, yes,
support.
Exactly. A lot of attention right now on the Biden administration's response to the war going on right now. And Jonathan Feldstein, I see you nodding your head right there in response to that. And of course, as an American raised here in the U.S., of course, you're now in Israel. What's your reaction when you see such political debates unfolding here in the U.S.?
Well, I think I agree with Jonathan, the other Jonathan, significantly. We're entering the actual year in which all of us are going to vote as Americans, and President Biden is just exactly Jonathan said, speaking out of both sides of his mouth. Different members of the administration doing the same, realizing that if they don't capture the far left of their party, they lose one state like Michigan, and President Biden becomes ex-President Biden.
Local sea traffic by replacing long voyages around South America's Cape Horn. An estimated 20,000 workers died during French control of the project, many due to tropical diseases such as malaria. 5,600 more perished during U.S. construction. For 79 days, but failed to win any concessions. The movement inspired a new generation of political activists, but China has cracked down on free speech and political opposition in the former British colony. 20 years ago, some 230,000 people in southern Asia were killed by a tsunami on December 26, 2004. The world's most powerful earthquake in 40 years beneath the Indian Ocean triggered the catastrophe. Apple launched its first Apple Macintosh computer 40 years ago on January 24, 1984. The Mac had a graphical user interface and was also cheaper and faster. It also marked the beginning of the company's large advertising campaigns. Andrew Thomas, NTD News. On carbide wafer, it starts to show semiconducting properties and can be turned on and off.
The good thing about graphene is not only can you make things smaller and faster and with less heat dissipation, you're actually using properties of electrons that are not accessible in silicon. So this is really a paradigm shift.
Graphene is also compatible with conventional microelectronic processing methods, potentially changing the future of the devices we use every day.
But we know we're opening a door in a major paradigm shift in doing electronics. Graphene is the next step. Who knows what the step's going to be after that? But there's a good chance that graphene can take over and be the paradigm for the next 50 years.
The team's measurements showed that their semiconductor has 10 times greater mobility than silicon, meaning the electrons move with very low resistance, which translates to faster computing. Andrew Thomas, NTD News.